Number 10. Duel to the death. A medieval duel was never really a good idea, even in the Middle Ages, and yet a mother of four sent her lover off on a bus to participate in a medieval duel with her ex-husband. Her name is Asta, 35 years old. The duel was her idea, and she wanted to see which of her admirers would win her hand in a fight to the death. Well, it didn't really matter in the end, because she had since been sentenced to spend the rest of her life in jail. Asta left her husband for a man she met online after he was released from a Lithuanian prison on charges of sexual assault. She ended her relationship with her husband to date this criminal. But the husband wasn't just going to let her walk away with another man. Both men were adamant that she belonged to them, so she decided that they can settle the argument in a fight to the death. After all, this seemed like the only logical solution to the problem, right? The new boyfriend, named Montes Fedaris, stabbed the ex-husband 35 times across his body and neck. He then bought a pizza on his way home so that he and Asta could have a bit of a celebration. A little slice of victory, if you will. Obviously, nobody got away with this crime. The police quickly found the murder weapon dumped in a garbage can, connected it to the new boyfriend, and then got the whole story from Asta. She was shocked when the judge gave her life with a minimum of 24 years for orchestrating the brutal murder. Number 9. A bad threesome. An Indiana woman has been left locked in jail after the police discovered a dead man and a tortured woman in her house. According to the New York Daily News, Heidi Kathleen Carter had contacted her victims through a dating app. She convinced her two victims to come over to her house for a three-way. Now, whatever you do in your own bedroom is your own business. But let's just say for the record that voluntarily going to a stranger's house to engage in adult activities with a small group of people that you've never met is probably a bad idea. In the middle of the night's activities, another man entered the house. He became enraged and beat one of the victims to death with a baseball bat. Then, Heidi pulled out a gun and helped the surprise guest, a man who had some vague relationship with her, as he tortured the female victim. How these people got captured is another bizarre part of the story. A cleaning lady came to visit the house and sat on what she thought was a pile of clothes and sheets, but it was actually a beaten corpse. She ran out of the house and flagged down a police officer. When the officer entered the home, he found the male suspect brandishing a weapon. The officer then shot and killed him, and the woman was taken into custody. Number 8. Fake business cards. Mark Nye is a criminal who looks a whole lot like the UFC fighter Conor McGregor. I mean, the resemblance is uncanny. Mark understood that he looked a little bit like the UFC legend, so he started producing business cards entitled McGregor Enterprise and handing them out to his customers. Who were his customers? They were people who liked to use drugs. Mark was a drug dealer, and he foolishly made his very own business cards as a kind of front for his operations. Naturally, the police ended up getting a hold of his cards. If you're selling illegal drugs and trying to stay away from the police, having hundreds of business cards with your number on them is probably a bad idea, right? The police were able to link the cards directly to the drug dealer, at which point they locked him up for almost 3 years. When they pulled him over in his car, they found hundreds of business cards, as well as a few mobile phones and a bunch of drugs. Number 7. Traveling solo. There's nothing wrong with being a solo traveler, but if you're going to journey into the Montana mountains by yourself with no way of signaling for help, you may be asking for trouble. The police are still trying to find out what happened to Tatum Morrell, the 23-year-old woman who went hiking and was never seen again. She set off by herself from the West Fork trailhead near Red Lodge on July 2nd. When she didn't reach out to anyone after several days, her family got a hold of the police. They sent canine search teams into the mountains to try and find her, but they came up empty. By July 10th, the police gave up, saying that she was probably already dead and that there was really nothing they can do about it. Sadly, this is just one of those dangers of hiking by yourself. Honestly, it's a bad idea, and in this case, it backfired. Tatum was planning to climb over 5 mountain peaks in the area, with some of them over 12,000 feet tall. But somewhere between the trailhead and the mountaintops, disaster struck, and she was lost forever. Even all these months later, nobody really knows what happened to Tatum Morrell in the Montana wilderness. Would you ever be brave enough to go into the wilderness by yourself? Let us know your thoughts in the comments, and while you're at it, don't forget to hit subscribe. Number 6. The Voyage of the Satoshi. The Satoshi was a very bad idea that went horribly wrong. 3 cryptocurrency enthusiasts purchased a cruise ship as part of their dream to begin a floating libertarian utopia. But like any group of people who have ever tried to start a utopia, it was a complete failure. The idea was something called seasteading, which is basically where people live on a boat out at sea without being part of any land-based nation. This group wanted to build small communities that would be permanently based as sea platforms, which would be out of reach of any international laws. Eventually, they hoped there would be millions of people living in floating cities. The first step was the voyage of the Satoshi. Grant Ramont, Rudiger Koch, and Chad Elwertowski purchased the vessel in 2020 and planned to anchor it off the coast of Panama. Residents were to purchase their cabins using cryptocurrency. In fact, everything was to be purchased using crypto, with the roughly 2,000 people on board the ship living a life of peace and harmony. But the plan fell through when the owners failed to secure insurance for the ship. Nobody would agree to insure the ship as a floating city. They ran out of money and were forced to sell the boat in 2021 to a cruise line startup. Like every single attempt in human history to create a utopia, this one failed. But sadly, it failed even before it could be started. Number 5. Jaguar Selfie. If you're visiting the Wildlife World Zoo in Arizona, it's perfectly okay to take a selfie with any animal you find there. Just be sure that when you take the selfie, you're standing on the proper side of the barricade. A woman, who has not been named for privacy reasons, had the bad idea to climb over a barrier so that she could get closer to a female jaguar. Her motivation behind the terrible decision? To take a selfie. After all, the barrier was in her way of an awesome Instagram opportunity. Well, she never did get the selfie that she wanted to so badly. When she got close enough to the jaguar's cage, it reached its paw through the bars and tried to kill her. These are extremely powerful cats and should not be messed around with. It grabbed a hold of her arm and nearly tore it off. According to Adam Wilkerson, who was unfortunate enough to witness this brutal attack, he could actually see its claws scraping into her flesh. If it hadn't been for a group of good Samaritans who distracted the jaguar by throwing water bottles through its cage, this woman probably would have wound up dead. The witnesses managed to distract the cat long enough for her to get away from the cage and back over the barrier. She was then taken to the hospital and treated for lacerations. The woman made a full recovery and then went back to the zoo. But don't worry, this time her visit was to apologize. She admitted her wrongdoing and took full responsibility for her horrible decision-making skills. Number 4. A very stupid game. A couple of teenagers with a really bad idea recently ended up dead. The deaths were purely by accident, but the accident was the result of an insane game that the teens had decided to play. According to the school resource officer who knew these kids, ages between 14 and 15, the game involved scoring points. It was basically real-life Grand Theft Auto. The kids would steal a car and get the police to chase them. Points were based on how many cops were in pursuit and whether or not they got away. And apparently, these boys had played the game before. One of them, the driver of the car, had an extensive record of auto theft. Here's where the deaths come in. It was Friday, and the North St. Paul police spotted the same stolen car for the third day in a row. The previous 2 times, officers had chased the car but given up the pursuit because whoever was driving had been too reckless. This was all part of the teens' game, but on Friday, the chase got too out of hand. The driver ended up crashing the car on someone's lawn, completely totaling the vehicle. The crash killed his 2 passengers. All 3 of them were students at the North High School in North St. Paul. They were what you might call bad apples. Because of the situation surrounding the deaths of the teens, the one driving the car has been charged with 2 counts of criminal vehicular homicide. It's impossible to say where these kids came up with such a terrible idea. They weren't doing it for money, but may have been inspired by video games. Number 3. Dangerous fireworks. Christy Enema just about lost her right hand in a terrible example of fireworks gone wrong. According to Christy, she never expected this kind of thing to happen to her. After all, you hear about accidents with fireworks all the time, but never think you'll be the victim. Well, Christy became the victim on Labor Day weekend. The mother of 4 was sitting around a bonfire with her family. Somebody handed her a preloaded mortar firework. Not thinking of the danger, she happily took the firework and aimed it up in the sky. That was when her son leaned over and said, "Mom, this is a bad idea." But as always, mother knows best. She told her son that it would be fine, and a fraction of a second later, the firework malfunctioned and exploded in her hand like a pipe bomb. This was not the type of fireworks injury that a person could laugh off. It was serious, with paramedics needing to be called and Christy needing to be rushed to the hospital. It took her a minute to realize just how bad it was, but when she looked down after a few seconds of being in shock, she saw her fingers were barely still on her hand. She ended up getting 5 surgeries and 9 months of therapy. She now has 4 plates and cadaver bones in her hand. She might get up to 80% functionality back, but then again, she might not. And all because she had to go messing around with fireworks. Number 2. Arguing in the street. In California, a couple of guys got in a minor accident on the I-80. Regardless of whose fault it was, the crash wasn't that bad. The Chevy Malibu and Dodge Durango blocked 2 lanes of traffic, with each car a little busted up. But this is 2021 after all, and everybody seems to be completely out of their minds. The 2 men got out of their vehicles, stood in the middle of the street, and started fighting. It didn't get physical, but they were standing in the middle of the road screaming at each other, while cars were speeding by. Obviously, this is a bad idea. But here comes the second bad idea. A man driving a Mini Cooper saw the accident, did not slow down, and tried to swerve around the collision. In his rush to get wherever he was going, he ignored all the unwritten civil rules of the road. If there's a crash, slow down and be careful. When he tried to maneuver around the accident, he drove over the 2 men who were arguing in the street. The guy in the Mini Cooper was driving so fast that he killed both of them. According to the California Highway Patrol, they first received word of a verbal argument in the street. Less than 1 minute later, they were getting calls about a vehicle crash, 2 dead bodies, and a banged-up Mini Cooper. And number 1. A bad rock. Ken White was the passenger in a van that was driving down the street in 2017. From out of nowhere, a giant rock fell from an overpass directly above, smashed through the windshield, and killed him. Ken did not do anything wrong. Instead, it was 5 Michigan teenagers who were loitering on the overpass when one of them got the bright idea to start throwing rocks at the cars driving beneath them. At the time, the kids were all under 18. They were just a bunch of hooligans not thinking about the consequences. But in this case, there were serious consequences. The ringleader of the teenagers, Kyle Anger, was tried as an adult and slapped with charges of manslaughter. He ended up being stuck in the court system until 2019. That's when he finally pleaded guilty. The judge handed down a sentence of 39 months in prison, and all because he picked up a rock and threw it over a bridge. If that's not a bad idea gone wrong, I don't know what is.
Number 10. Punched to death. An aspiring rap artist was killed over a measly $5 bet. He wasn't killed on purpose, but instead punched to death by a woman who the police then tried to bring up on charges of murder. The murderer in this case is Tiffany Starks, a woman with such a mean right hook that a single punch to the face caused John Fatboy Powell to fall over dead. Yet the only reason she punched John was to help him earn $5. Somebody else at the party was offering $5 to anyone who would take a punch from a female. John, wanting to be a tough guy, agreed to let any girl punch him in the face for the money. Tiffany, wanting to get in on the action, agreed to do it. But that was when it all went wrong. After John was punched, he collected his $5, walked away to talk with a group of friends, and collapsed just seconds later. It was from a burst artery in his neck. He was rushed to the hospital, where doctors declared him deceased. An autopsy then ruled that he died from a brain hemorrhage. Tiffany, just 5'5", cleaned his clock so good with one punch, his brain basically exploded. Tiffany was charged with reckless conduct, and so too was the guy who offered the $5 bet in the first place. But later on, Tiffany was ultimately acquitted of any murder charges. Number 9. The Chewbacca birth. As part of a wager, a woman agreed to wear a Chewbacca mask while she gave birth to her baby. Her name is Katie Stricker Curtis. As she gave birth to her son Jaden, she screamed behind the face of Chewbacca. Even more hilarious, she allowed herself to be filmed while having some very painful contractions with the mask on her face. From the outside, it almost looks as if she's laughing rather than screaming. How did she get roped into such a strange situation? It happened near the end of her pregnancy. For Christmas, her brother bought her the Chewbacca mask and suggested that she laugh all the way through labor. Nobody thought she would do it, but she proved them wrong. Her doctors, the nurses, and everybody at the hospital thought it was hilarious. And in the end, the silliness of having her baby while dressed like Chewbacca really helped everything go a lot smoother. It must be true what they say. Laughter really is the best medicine. Number 8. Savage purification. After a man in India lost a bet to some friends, he agreed to hand his wife over to them for a night of fun. It's just as bad as it sounds. He didn't have the money to pay for his gambling debt that he acquired while making bets with his group of buddies, so he offered them his wife to do whatever they wanted with for the night. When his wife refused, he became so angry that he threw acid on her. But it gets even worse. At first, the wife didn't refuse. She agreed to do what her husband said, until about the 4th time. Then she decided enough was enough, and she would no longer entertain his pals. That was when he threw acid on her. He told police later that he wanted to purify her because she wouldn't listen to him. But the acid didn't do any kind of purification. It simply melted her face. Luckily, the woman was able to get away from her psychotic husband and run to a police station, and he has since been arrested. Number 7. Killed by the Kansas police. A couple of kids who made a $2 wager on a match of Call of Duty ended up getting an innocent stranger gunned down by the Kansas police. As unbelievable as that is, it really happened. When police officers in Wichita were sent to a fake shooting call, orchestrated by 2 Call of Duty players who were nowhere near the scene, a man was blown to pieces. It's part of a phenomenon called swatting. It's when one person makes a false report to the police that ends up bringing them to somebody else's house. It's become a huge issue in the streaming community, specifically on Twitch. But normally, it just results in a lot of confusion, not a completely innocent person dying. Shane Gaskill and Casey Viner were the ones betting on the match. After they got into an argument, Casey was so mad that he asked internet troll Tyler Barris to swat Shane for him. But he got the address partly wrong. The address that the guys got a hold of was indeed Shane's house, but it wasn't occupied by him. Shane was renting it to a man named Andrew Finch. Andrew had no idea what was going on. When Tyler phoned the police and told him that there was an active hostage situation at the house, the police moved in, believing they were dealing with a madman with a gun. Andrew knew nothing about it. He opened the door to the police completely oblivious, and the police didn't ask any questions before opening fire and shooting him to death in the doorframe. And yes, the Kansas police have since gotten into a whole heap of trouble over it, but so too have the Call of Duty players, who are looking at serious jail time for the prank gone wrong. Number 6. Aeroflot Flight 6502. Aeroflot Flight 6502 was a domestic passenger flight going from the Soviet city of Sverdlovsk to Grozny on October 20th, 1986. But before the plane ever touched down, it crashed and killed 70 out of the 94 of the passengers and crew. When investigators looked into what caused the accident, they determined it to be negligence on the behalf of the pilot. It all went down, literally, because of a bet the captain made with the first officer. Captain Kliuyev made a bet with the first officer Zhirnov as they approached the airport that he could make the approach using nothing but the instruments and closing the cockpit windows. What this means is he put curtains over the windows of the cockpit and relied on nothing but his instruments to make contact with the ground. It was a complete disaster. Air traffic control warned the pilot that he was getting too close to the ground at an altitude of just 200 feet, but he didn't make the necessary adjustments. The aircraft hit the runway at 150 knots and flipped upside down. Pretty much everybody on board died immediately. 63 people died instantly upon impact, while 7 more perished later in the hospital. Among the passengers, it was surprisingly 14 children who survived. As for the pilot, the one who lost the worst bet in history, he was given 15 years in prison, but later had his sentence reduced to 6 with time served. Do you think 6 years in jail is enough for the incidental murder of 70 people? He may not have intended to kill them, but he definitely did, and all because of a stupid bet. Let us know your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to hit subscribe before the end of the video. Number 5. Faking death. A man in Bangladesh lost a bet on a cricket mat of $1,800. He made the bet without thinking he could possibly lose, and he didn't have the money to pay it. When he realized how much trouble he was in, he decided to fake his own death and have it posted on social media platforms. He and some friends hired a makeup artist and part-time videographer to film him being murdered. In the video, 3 people can be seen attacking the man and then slitting his throat. But it wasn't blood that came out. It was red fruit juice syrup. With his murder documented, he had the video uploaded to social media by an anonymous source. He also made sure that the person he owed money to for the bet received the video in his inbox. But you know who else got the video? The police and his relatives. A search was underway for his corpse, with his parents panicking and the police frantic to catch the killers. It was total chaos. But the police aren't dumb and soon figured out what happened. They arrested the makeup artist who spilled the beans. Then they captured the man who faked his own death and charged him with illegal betting. Betting is actually illegal in Bangladesh, and it's a big enough crime that you can go away for years just for making a single wager. Number 4. Betting behind the wheel. The driver of a truck was using his mobile phone to place bets when he drove over a beloved dad of 4. His name is Dean Moffat, and the bet he placed was only $20. He just couldn't wait until he stopped his truck. He had to put money down on a greyhound race now. He made the bet as he drove along the A34 near Winchester in England. For the Americans watching, the A34 is basically an interstate. It wasn't the first time he bet while driving. After all, as a truck driver, he spent almost all his time on long journeys across the United Kingdom. People who know him told police that he was often placing bets, reading emails, and even scrolling through Facebook while behind the wheel. He even told the police that using his phone never distracted him before, and yet it obviously did. 14 minutes after the crash, he deleted the betting applications on his phone. He knew what he did was wrong. As his eyes were on the screen, desperately trying to make some money off a greyhound race, he plowed into Rick Mbomba. Rick had broken down on the side of the road and had just finished getting a spare tire out of his trunk. That was when Dean Moffat drove over him, right in front of his 2 teenage children. Rick had been driving his 19-year-old daughter to university when he got a flat. But instead of going to school, the poor girl had to watch her dad get run over by a gambling addict. Number 3. Losing the kid. In India, a woman divorced her husband after she found out that he had lost their son gambling. The man has been identified in local reports only as Moshin, a resident of New Delhi. He was a locally known gambling addict, notorious for digging himself into seriously deep holes. But the last hole proved too big to climb out of. He had actually bet his entire family, meaning if he lost, he would have handed over his wife and both of their children. But he managed to talk the guy down to just one of his kids, which honestly seems like a pretty generous offer. Sadly, the child is gone. He was handed over as part of the bet, and nobody has seen him since. The woman, when she found out, went to the police, but they refused to take the case. She had to file a petition at a district court, and it took 2 years before investigators finally agreed to look into the matter. But last we heard, no headway has been made. The only silver lining is that the wife was luckily able to divorce her husband and marry a younger man. Hopefully the new husband won't try to give her and the kids away as part of a bet gone wrong. Number 2. Unpaid debt. In the Canadian province of British Columbia, Andrew Barry was recently on trial for murdering his 2 daughters. Aubrey Barry, 4 years old, and Chloe Barry, 6 years old, were discovered stabbed to death in their apartment on Christmas Day 2017. The main suspect was their father, Andrew, whom the police found full of stab wounds bleeding out in the apartment bathtub. The trial went on for 5 years. Andrew Barry claimed that he would never have killed his own daughters and gave an alternative account of what happened. The Crown prosecutors alleged that Andrew used a baseball bat and knife to massacre Chloe, then just the knife to stab Aubrey to death, before filling himself with stab wounds. But he said that somebody with dark skin and dark hair broke into the apartment, killed his daughters, and then left him for dead. He said that he owed a massive gambling debt to a loan shark named Paul. He claimed that he had a very serious gambling addiction, and that the loan shark killed his family to settle up what was owed. But in the end, the jury didn't believe him. After 5 long years, Andrew was found guilty on 2 counts of second-degree murder and sent to jail. We'll never know if he really did have outstanding debts, but the jury definitely didn't believe the story. Number 1. Shaking a baby. Mark Lackenby lost a bet and shook a baby. There's really no easy way to say that. The 32-year-old father had put up a bet on Arsenal's Champions League match against Barcelona that Arsenal's Robin van Persie would score the first goal. But as he was watching the game on TV with his 5-week-old daughter Ruby, he lost. He watched as Barcelona's David Villa scored the first goal instead. Mark was so furious that he picked up his baby daughter and shook her in anger. He shook her so hard that she suffered from catastrophic brain injuries. Tragically, she died the next day. This was a horrific case, and luckily Mark was sentenced at the Sheffield Crown Court to 10 years in jail for manslaughter. He escaped the murder charge, but was still guilty of the killing. He was also found guilty of causing grievous bodily harm from a previous incident the week before the fatal injuries, in which he had broken the child's ribs. Clearly, this guy should not be having babies, and he won't be able to now, at least not for the next decade.
Number 10. Violent payback. A 19-year-old student named Alessandra da Costa Pereira was stabbed to death on her very own doorstep after she saved her ex-boyfriend's life. Here's how it all happened, because the details are pretty bizarre. The relationship between Alessandra and Rafael ended 3 months prior to the attack. Throughout the 3 months, Rafael had been trying to get back together, but Alessandra wasn't interested in backtracking her love life. Rafael went into a dark spiral. His life began to fall apart, and he started to go a little crazy. Anyone who's ever been through a rough breakup knows what we're talking about, but Rafael pushed it to the extreme. A few days before he knifed Alessandra in the gut, he had one particularly outrageous meltdown. He blew up her phone, and when she finally answered, he said she was going to throw himself to his death. Alessandra didn't want to get back together with him, but she didn't want him to die either. She was nice enough to rush where Rafael was having his meltdown and take him to the hospital for mental treatment. She really did save his life. Days later, he killed her. He first went to her house with a bouquet of flowers, groveling at her feet to take him back. When she refused for the final time, he pulled out his knife and stabbed her 10 times in the chest, abdomen, arms, and legs. And he did it right in front of her mom, who was standing behind the doorway screaming. Number 9. Trying to help a dog. A woman ended up dead while trying to help a dog. Her name was Christina Green, and she went out of her way to save a stray dog in trouble on the highway. But the act of kindness turned into a death sentence for the 31-year-old woman. As she tried to catch the dog and get it to safety, she was struck by a crazy man driving a truck. He literally ran her over. According to the authorities in Albertville, Christina spotted the stray dog near US 431. She was sitting in the passenger seat and ordered the driver of the car to pull over so she could try to help. She left the vehicle, crossed the northbound lanes, jumped over the median, and was smacked by a truck. It was the worst game of Frogger that's ever been played. This is a busy intersection, a lot of traffic, and it was almost pitch black when Christina tried to run across the road. The truck driver probably could have been going a little slower or paying more attention. But then again, he probably didn't even see the woman. Police say the driver cooperated with the investigation and is not facing any charges. Family members say Christina Green just celebrated a birthday and was engaged to be married. But now all of this is over because her heart was simply too big. She saw a dog in trouble and put her own life at risk to save it. Not something just any person would do. Number 8. Hit and run. A nurse was off duty when she stopped along a Rhode Island freeway early on Sunday morning to help a motorist who'd just gotten in an accident. Jennifer Toscano was on her way back from a Halloween party when she stopped along Route 95 North in Pawtucket. It was about 2 o'clock in the morning, and there had just been a terrible accident. A car had just rolled across the highway, and the people involved clearly needed medical attention. One was stuck in the car and couldn't get out. But here's where everything went bad. The Good Samaritan nurse was busy helping the motorist when another vehicle came out of nowhere, ran her over, and then sped off like nothing happened. The nurse died on the scene, her insides all scrambled from when she had been smacked by the huge bumper of the car. She was the mother of a teenage boy. She worked at the Bridgewater State Hospital, and she was what you might call a contributing member of society. These are all the kinds of good people you want in a society. But when we turn to the person that murdered her with the car, it was hard to say the same. Police had to chase the driver down, but they did catch him. He was then charged with drunk driving and leaving the scene of an accident. His name is Luis Baez from Massachusetts, and he was driving on a suspended license. He wasn't even supposed to be in the car, yet he still managed to run somebody over. Number 7. Good Samaritan in the subway. Roland Houston died trying to save a stranger from a vicious gang attack. It happened at a New York City subway station. A group of individuals threatened a man who was just waiting for the train. They taunted him with a knife. They didn't know this person. They had no reason to attack him, but they were teenagers, and they were up to no good. The victim was beaten mercilessly and then pushed onto the tracks. That was all in front of a witness too, and nobody did anything to help the victim getting beaten to death and pushed around. But when he hit the tracks, Roland finally jumped into action. The train was coming, and there was no time to lose. Sadly for Roland though, there was no time to get in there and save the man either. As Roland was trying to get the victim off the tracks, he was struck and obliterated by the oncoming train. Roland died immediately, but the victim of the gang assault walked away with nothing except a broken arm. Roland died a hero, giving his life for a total stranger. As for the greasy teenagers who went out of their way to try to kill a man, at least 3 have been taken into custody so far. The group was half a dozen in size, and NYPD have tracked down about half of them. All the boys are between the ages of 16 and 17, all of them facing murder and robbery charges. What would you do if you saw a gang of teenagers picking on an innocent man? Let us know in the comments below, and if you're liking this video, be sure to hit the thumbs up and subscribe button if you haven't already. Number 6. Anger at a car crash. A man was killed after getting punched in the head at an intersection in Philadelphia. It all started with a fender bender in May of 2021. According to the Philadelphia police, the man who got in the crash was the employee of Wei Lin. Because the driver doesn't speak any English, he called his boss to come over and translate. Being a reasonable and good person, Wei Lin dropped what he was doing and went to the scene of the accident to help out his friend. But that was when a passenger in the other vehicle, Jose Figueroa, stepped into the street and got violent. He wasn't even the one who was driving, and yet he had the most road rage out of anyone involved. Completely unprovoked, he punched Wei Lin once in the head, so hard that he died. Wei fell to the ground unconscious from Jose's fist colliding with his skull. He was rushed to the hospital, but sadly, he passed away 3 days later. He never even knew what had happened. One second he was assisting his friend as a translator, and the next, everything was dark. Jose Figueroa has since been charged with manslaughter and will be spending the rest of his youth locked behind bars. Number 5. Death in the middle. 19-year-old Yosef Al-Hasnawi tried to start an altercation, but tragically, his attempt failed and he was killed. According to the Hamilton police, the brave young man was only trying to do what he thought was right. He tried to help a senior gentleman who was being attacked by 2 men outside his mosque. The 2 men were bullying the older one, getting rough with him, and the teen wasn't standing for it. He got between them, and that was when the men shot him to death right there on the spot. The murderers have since been charged for the death, and now Yosef's family is trying to sue the paramedics for not providing the proper treatment for their injured son. This is because, according to eyewitnesses, the paramedics who arrived at the scene took too long to treat the young boy and acted as if his wounds weren't as bad as what they really were. They were trying to shrug it off like Yosef hadn't just taken a bullet. Yosef's father and 2 brothers say the paramedics and police were both negligent by failing to provide first aid and transfer Yosef in a timely manner to the hospital. They're now trying to get $10 million in compensation for the emotional and mental distress they suffered as they watched Yosef die. Number 4. Burning down the house. In Arizona, Corey Sanders was murdered on a Sunday afternoon when he tried to help his neighbor, whose house had caught on fire. Nobody could have imagined what would happen when flames started licking the walls of the house. People in the neighborhood simply thought a fire had broken out, and the people inside were in trouble. They never could have dreamt that a maniac would drive up for no reason, get out of their car, and start shooting everybody. At 3:45 p.m., fire crews were dispatched. This was around the same time that Corey ran over and tried to lend his own hand. But something else was happening in the same vicinity at the same time. An ambulance had been dispatched to a park just across the street, and these emergency vehicles showed up with their sirens blaring. And that was when Leslie Scarlett, a criminal who had just been released from jail after a 6-year sentence for armed robbery, decided he was going to go on a killing spree. Leslie walked up to the ambulance, put his gun in the window, and shot the EMT in the driver's seat right in the head. He also shot the EMT in the passenger seat in the arm and chest. One was taken to the ICU in critical condition, while the other was taken to the hospital with minor injuries. Feeling good about shooting the 2 paramedics, Leslie then walked across the street to the burning home where firefighters had started battling the flames. Corey was also there trying to help. Leslie stood in the middle of the street, calmly reloaded his gun, and then started shooting at anybody and everything. Corey was shot in the head and killed instantly, right in front of his 11-year-old boy. Another neighbor was grazed by a bullet. One firefighter was struck in the arm, and then Leslie drove away. Police eventually caught up to Leslie at an intersection where a firefight ensued. Officer Danny Leon shot back, incapacitating Leslie. The shooter was brought to the hospital, where he was later pronounced dead. Number 3. An angry customer. A man at a grocery store became so upset that a young girl cut in front of him in the line that he punched her, punched the cashier, and then stabbed the Good Samaritan who tried to get between him and the young women. It happened in Berwyn at Valley's Produce. It was 10 o'clock in the morning, and this guy was already having the worst day of his life. The girl who cut in front of him was just 14 and she hadn't even cut in front of him to buy anything. According to the police chief, she had just been asking the cashier how much the bottle cost. But the customer got mad anyway. He started swearing. He punched the girl in the face. He punched the girl's mother, and then he tried to flee the store. That was when the Good Samaritan stepped in. He wasn't able to let some psycho back onto the street after he had beat up a little girl. But by the time he realized the irate customer had a knife, it was already plunged into his stomach. The man was taken to the hospital, where he was pronounced dead just an hour later. Meanwhile, the customer was desperately trying to get away. A second Good Samaritan confronted him as he tried to make his escape, and the second guy was stabbed in the torso. It wasn't a life-threatening injury, and he was later released from the hospital. Police eventually found the suspect hiding in a random backyard and arrested him. Number 2. Crushed by wreckage. In British Columbia, Canada, a Good Samaritan stopped along the side of the highway to help the victim of a crash. But he wasn't run over by a drunk driver in the middle of the night, not even attacked by a rampaging moose on the side of the road. Instead, the wreckage shifted suddenly as he was trying to help the victim, and the whole mess fell and crushed him. According to the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, the Good Samaritan was traveling along Highway 93. He witnessed a green Chevrolet Tahoe lost control, veer into the oncoming lane, and then plunged down an embankment. But he wasted no time hurrying to the rescue. He climbed down the 150-foot embankment to help the driver trapped in the vehicle. But as he was trying to get the driver out, the wreckage shifted and rolled. It went down the embankment like a snowball, crushing the Good Samaritan, as if somebody had let loose a giant bowling ball from the top of the gully. And number 1, failed rescue. In Georgia, 2 women got struck on the railroad tracks. Shirley Treadwell, 93, and Deborah Hall, 66, drove onto the railroad tracks and couldn't get their vehicle going again. This normally wouldn't be too big of a deal, except the fact that an oncoming train was speeding towards them. A man named Chris Burkett, a guy who just so happened to have recently survived his house being leveled by a tornado, saw the women in distress and ran to help. As he was trying to get them out of their vehicle, the train ran all 3 of them over. It's not clear how exactly the women got stuck. They were driving an SUV and shouldn't have had any trouble getting off some measly train tracks. But whatever the case, they just couldn't move the vehicle. And even though the train was only about 20 yards away, Chris didn't hesitate to try to rescue them. He went straight to the car, desperately trying to open the door and get the women out, but the train was coming too fast. There just wasn't enough time. Chris could have jumped out of the way and saved himself, but he continued his rescue effort until the very last moment. When the train hit, all 3 of them died pretty much instantly. What's the most tragic thing you've ever seen happen to somebody who just wanted to help? Let us know in the comments, and thanks for watching. For more shocking videos, remember to hit subscribe and check out the other great stuff from the channel. We'll see you next time.